Good afternoon. I'm Bonnie Thornton-Dill. I'm Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this special event this evening that is co-sponsored with the College of Journalism. I'm so proud, really, to have the opportunity to say just a word about the college and the Israel Studies program before I bring the director of the Israel Studies program forward. The College of Arts and Humanities really has, among the things that it focuses on, collaboration, creativity, and communication. And certainly, the Israel Studies program is key in accomplishing those goals. The Israel Studies program here at the University of Maryland is the largest in the country. It has grown rapidly under the leadership of Yoram Perry, and it has many students, many programs. They are collaborating with the university in Shanghai. They're collaborating with Tel Aviv University. They are engaged around the world in bringing the issues, the culture, all of the kinds of things that we need to be talking about and want to learn more about Israel, bringing it to our students on this campus and bringing their knowledge and insight to many other institutions. So we're really very proud of the work that has taken place in the Israel Studies program. I'm really also pleased about this evening because, you know, sometimes you get a perspective on your own society by looking comparatively at other societies. And this opportunity to look comparatively at Israel and the United States, or at Israel, and then to understand the United States through that, particularly in terms of many of the things that are taking place with the media and the relationship of the executive branch to the media, is really important. And it's particularly important in this time because we are facing a number of challenges in this society that many of us, certainly those of you who are my age, did not expect to be facing again in our lifetimes, really. Antisemitism is public and almost being normalized. White supremacy is being normalized. We're facing some very challenging times that question many of the values that we certainly stand for at this university and that many of us have worked to achieve. And because of that, I think these kinds of conversations are even more important today. So I'm really glad many of you are here. I'm glad to acknowledge the work of Israel Studies and to introduce our guests, the director of the Israel Studies program, Yoram Perry, will come forward. Yoram.
Thank you, Bonnie, for your wonderful words, very important ones. And I'm very happy to see you all, particularly the students. There are many students with us. That's wonderful. What I would like to do is to introduce myself. I'm Yoram Perry, the K Chair in Israel Studies and the director of the Alma and Joe Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies. I will introduce my colleague who will, together with me, will discuss, interview, talk to our guest. And then I will say a few words about Haaretz, which I guess some people, particularly the young ones, don't know. How many of you see, read, watch Haaretz? Let's see. Oh, more than I thought. Wonderful. That's wonderful. Okay. So first one is Dana Priest, a journalist, a writer, and a teacher who worked for nearly 30 years for the Washington Post, and since 2014 is the John S. and James L. Knight Chair in Public Affairs Journalism at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism in our campus. She's the most distinguished journalist, specializing in the field of national security, and she won several prestigious prizes because of her excellent work. I'll mention only a few of them. If I have to mention more, it will take half of the evening. In 2006, she won the Pulitzer Prize for Best Reporting, citing her reports on the secret black site, prisons, and other controversial features of the government's counterterrorism campaign. When I say government, I mean the American government, not the Israeli. In 2008, the Washington Post won the annual Pulitzer Prize for Public Service because of her work with some other colleagues, exposing mistreatment of wounded veterans at the Walter Reed Hospital. The story caused an uproar across the United States and resulted in the resignation of the Secretary of Army, Francis J. Harvey. Dana Priest was also a recipient of the MacArthur Grant, the Gerald R. Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on the National Defense in 2001, and the 2004 New York Public Library's Helen Bernstein Book Award of Excellence in Journalism. Aluf, a friend of mine from Israel, he's the son of an Israeli poet, Aryeh Sivan, who got the Israel Prize for Literature. He was born in Ramat HaSharon, where I lived for most of my life before I came here. And he did his MA in Tel Aviv University in business administration. He began to be a journalist in '86 in a local newspaper called Ha'ir, the town in Tel Aviv. And since '89, he moved to Haaretz, the paper. There, he had a very long list of positions, from a writer, and news editor, investigative reporting. He was very much involved in security and defense issues. He was a diplomatic correspondent, editor of the op-ed page, and since 2011, the chief editor. He also published a lot at the New York Times, The Guardian, Foreign Affairs, and Newsweek. As a diplomatic correspondent, he covered 6 prime ministers, starting from Rabin and ended with Olmert. And also, when I'm thinking of the 2 names, one was assassinated, the other one just came out of jail a few weeks ago. I hope it has nothing to do with you. And he covered the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. I'll just mention one story which is relevant to us in general and to Dana in particular. In the year 1988, when he was a journalist in Ha'ir, he published for the first time the name of the head of the Israeli intelligence agency. For that, he was taken to court. And the decision of the Supreme Court was a dramatic decision that changed the nature of censorship in Israel. And since then, the court accepted the position of the paper and argued that publishing the name of that particular person, the head of the intelligence agency, is not really a secret, should not really be a secret. Secret should be only those issues that have a direct, immediate, and a prominent threat or hurting the public security when it's very clear and very immediate. So since then, the entire attitude of the Israeli censor has changed. All right, enough about Aluf. I'm sure we'll talk about you later on when we'll talk about you. Now, let me say a few words about Haaretz, for those who don't know the paper. It was established 100 years ago in 1918. And it is described as Israel's New York Times. Broadsheet, high quality, read by the Israeli elite, by the political elite, by the business elite. And the logo of the paper is a newspaper for thinking people. And this is in today's atmosphere of populism, this is a terrible thing for thinking people. Who needs thinking people? We are going to tell you what to think. It became more radical lately when the tension in Israel and the gap between the left and the right, the liberals and the conservatives, became deeper. So I'll read to you what David Remnick wrote in the New Yorker about the paper 2 or 3 years ago. Haaretz is essentially the most liberal newspaper in Israel and arguably the most liberal institution in a country that has moved inexorably to the right in the past decade. So it's not only a paper, it's an institution. And in a letter to the editors in English, the English edition began to be published in 1997, and the digital version in 2012. So in the letter to the editors, to the readers in English, an open letter by the publisher, he says that he asked people to subscribe to Haaretz and help shape Israel. By doing so, you will become a partner in the ongoing effort to shape Israel as a liberal and constitutional democracy that cherishes the value of pluralism and civil and human rights. You will become a partner in actively supporting the two-state solution and the right to Palestinian self-determination, which will enable Israel to rid itself of the burdens of territorial occupation and the control of other people. So this is, in few words, what Haaretz is. Let me just thank very much people who help us to organize that event. In our institute, Paul Shem, Avis Conman, Jacqueline Hopkins, and Greg Schofer. And I want to thank the Dean of the School of Journalism as well. And I will ask you to join me and we'll start grilling you. Yeah. Dana, please start. I spoke too long.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
Can you, there are so many similarities happening vis-a-vis the executive and the media in the United States and Israel. So why don't you start by giving us some examples?
Well, you know, the most natural position for any journalist in any beat, in any position as writer, editor, TV personality, whatever, is the opposition. So, because the story is more interesting. When you support the government or partly support the government, it's less exciting. So on one hand, we're under attack. In Israel, it's the same leadership for almost 9 years now, but approaching 9 years. But in 2015, Israel went through a quiet revolution. You had the same person as prime minister, but very different government with very different goals. If the goal before that was to mitigate any American pressure by President Obama to move forward in the peace process, then in 2015, Netanyahu felt, and the election result enabled it, felt strong enough to build a purely right-wing coalition. And to do it again when he decided to expand his political base, his parliamentary base, last year, and after hundreds of hours of negotiating with the Labour Party, decided to bring another right-wing party into the coalition. And the goal of this particular government is to legitimize Israel's occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, mainly through delegitimizing all those people who oppose it or speak up against it. And that goes to trying to change the Supreme Court composition, which is more difficult in Israel. It's a different system that we have than here. It's through changing or threatening to change or cut budgets of cultural institutions or filmmakers who get government subsidies if they're critical of the IDF or of Israeli conduct in general, and the list goes on and on. And we became the only voice of opposition, not to Netanyahu the person. There's a lot of opposition in the Israeli media to Netanyahu as a person, as a leader, to his family, to the way he runs the country. But there's very little argument in the media about the basic narrative, which is that Israel is a small Jewish community surrounded by Nazis who threaten it with every day with a new Holocaust, and that the rest of the world, the West, is at best oblivious and at worst deeply anti-Semitic, and only that kind of policy could sustain Israel forever. And we're the only ones who are willing to ask questions about the narrative, which obviously brings more people to criticize Haaretz. It's not just, and in Israel, the challenges to, I mean, the criticism is not just from the government or from politicians. I mean, I can't recall in the past when senior political figures, leaders of parties, of political parties, cabinet ministers in prominent positions, calling on their Facebook feed to boycott a newspaper or to cancel subscriptions to a newspaper. But the main thing is kind of community policing, trying to convince people that it's not legitimate to read Haaretz or to buy Haaretz because it's not it's less than patriotic. And I don't know if you're facing the same challenges here from the kind of community pressure or just government or presidential pressure and criticism.
You know, it's a good question because the community that agrees with Donald Trump's criticism of the media, that we're fake news and we're traitors, and similar to Netanyahu's language on that, is growing. And it's actually, because those are the people who elected him. So can you explain?
Well, the debate here is this. On one hand, what we used to call in Israel the campfire, that was a kind of mainstream media that more or less told the same story. I remember when I was the night editor putting the paper together 25 years ago, we had only one TV channel in Israel, 2 radio channels, 4 daily newspapers, 5 daily newspapers. We all told the same story in different shades. Today, when you look at Israeli newspapers, different worlds. Mm-hmm. And the same thing, I guess, happened here with the advent of Fox News versus the mainstream media. So on one hand, it's far more democratic and far more, you have many more voices that can be heard, because when you're around the campfire, there are those who enjoy the warmth and the light, but then there are all those people out there in the dark and cold who don't like to be there. So now they can be heard, which is a good thing. At the same time, what you guys in the media professoring business were telling us all along, that news is views, that there is no such thing as news on one hand and views on the other hand. And Trump took it to the extreme that everything that I don't like to hear or read is fake.
But isn't there a grain of truth in the position, excuse me, both of Netanyahu and Trump, that the media became a political party? I just saw Benn yesterday saying, today you don't need parties. What you need is a television, a communication system, and an issue. No parties anymore. So didn't Haaretz become much more partisan today than it was 20, 30 years ago?
Not only Haaretz. It's less visible in the Israeli television channels that more or less still tell the same story, or radio channels. But the newspapers in Israel or news sites tell very, very different stories. It's not just Haaretz. We take one position, others have different position. But the thing is, and this is, I think, common to right-wing conservative criticism of the media, both in the United States and Israel, or in other words, the Israeli politicians read the playbook of American conservatives. What they call the media in Israel, the largest circulated newspaper belongs to Sheldon Adelson, and it's a very right-wing newspaper that's freely distributed in most street corners or workplaces or public places in Israel. They can't argue that the media is some other people, but they still use the same languages. If the media is a separate organization and they don't have a voice, you know, if you turn on Israeli television, most talking heads there are right-wing politicians. There is no real or government officials. There is no real oppositionary voice on Israeli television. So they pick on one or two reporters. For example, now they try to delegitimize the police reporters who covered the Netanyahu corruption investigation, and say that they are puppets of the left, who is trying, that the left is trying to oust the government through these police reporters. In other words, you delegitimize anything that doesn't fit your agenda. But generalizing the media is not partisan. I mean, there are right-wing media channels in the United States that are as big as the Washington Post.
Yeah.
And still, when they say the media, they always ignore the fact that there is media that supports the right-wing cause. And I think this wasn't like that 15 or 20 years ago.
Well, and I would say, I think the Washington Post and the New York Times and the others who are still in the mainstream, we do see each other, we see ourselves different than an opposition party, absolutely, because that's not really a tradition here. But because all of the editorials, all the editorial pages have really turned so against the president, I think it's difficult for the public to sometimes distinguish between our editorial page and our news pages. And we've always played the role of a skeptic vis-a-vis whatever president. Certainly we did it during the Obama administration as well. So I think there's a difference there. But my question is why do people believe Netanyahu when he says this is fake news? Like, there are a growing number here who believe Donald Trump when he says that we're fake news.
Because they support him.
By the way, you know that Netanyahu is using the English term fake news, which we didn't have in the past in Israel.
No, it's not only Netanyahu, it's the entire coterie of right-wing politicians. They fell in love with it, and it also, makes you globalized and international and a global leader when you're copying the president of the United States. I think that people support that because they want to see their favorite leader in power, and if they realize or if they feel that some other institutions, as you call us, are threatening or doubting the survivability of the leader, and in Israel we don't have fixed election terms as in the United States. It's coalition governments that can always fall apart, then they attack the critics.
Can you offer any examples of stories that you have done that actually that were critical and actually did reach across, bridged across ideology and actually, potentially change the minds of skeptics?
It's very difficult. Yeah. I mean, there are occasionally you have some scoop that the entire media and political landscape follow up. The latest one we had nothing to do with Netanyahu. It was that the Israeli government opposed adoptions by same-sex couples on the grounds that they cannot be fit to be parents or something like that. That was the government response to a Supreme Court appeal asking to allow these adoptions. And that was a firestorm, and the government had to backtrack.
Let me help you with a much more important story that Haaretz is involved with. Haaretz was the reason for the resignation of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin from his position. Yitzhak Rabin, when he was an ambassador in the United States, the family had a bank account. Then it was illegal for Israelis to have a bank account outside Israel. And when he became prime minister, they continued to keep that account, and his wife came to Washington and went to the bank to put some dollars, to take out some dollars cash some dollars from the account. And the correspondent of Haaretz knew about it, wrote about it. She was put to jail. And Rabin,
not to jail, no. She was indicted.
To the court.
Yeah.
And Rabin said that he will stand behind her, though it was her fault, and he resigned because of that. So that was one of the achievements of Haaretz.
Yeah, and that brought the right wing to power.
And Olmert, I think that the stories with Olmert, Prime Minister Olmert, who just came out of jail,
Well,
were revealed.
the first time that when he was convicted
Right.
was based on a story by our chief investigative writer, Gidi Weitz.
Right. So you see that,
Well,
that the
you
paper
haven't-
dealt
no,
with.
but
Go ahead, go
that's
ahead.
not about. But the question was about changing voters' perception, not about scooping and getting someone to be arrested or convicted or changing the government position or something like
But
that.
is that even something that you think about? I mean, I know that at the Post, we do think, who could I quote in this story that might give it more credibility to the people who don't believe the Washington Post? And it used to be that you could find, whatever the opposition party was, you could find people in the other side that they might believe. Or if you're doing an intelligence story, you could find a former CIA person. But now, given that Trump has also so dissed so many of the institutions of government, we really have a hard time finding people that would be credible
Well,
to some of those.
I'm sometimes jealous when I read stories about the current White House with, we spoke with dozens of sources, and like, wow, we don't have that access. I don't think there are dozens of sources like that in Israel, especially when the entire staff of the former staff of the prime minister is one by one spending their time at the police. We don't think about how to quote. No, we don't go through this thought process. What I do find is that in recent years, due to shrinking budgets and all the other well-known problems of journalism today, a lot of the investigative work has been privatized to NGOs, like the Coalition for Freedom of Information, or the Coalition for Openness of Budget, or other, organizations with different names, with for promoting social causes. Or there are think tanks that are partisan, and they do kind of investigative reporting, and you read more and more of their stuff all over the place because they have the budget, they focus on the mission. They don't have some, couple of general investigative reporters who do stories about the entire government, and that's where you could see partisan influence over the coverage, rather than just over the opinion pages or used as anonymous sources.
Can you share with an American audience what has happened to some of the individual reporters that have been targeted for criticism? It's quite harsher than it is in the United States.
Not much. There is a TV person, Amnon Abramovich, that the right wing loves to hate, but he still appears on prime time. They didn't cut although they have some regulatory issues, they didn't cut his appearances or anything like that. There is Raviv Drucker, the star of Channel 10, who became kind of personal enemy of the prime minister and his family, and he's the star of the channel. I mean, the channel didn't backtrack under the pressure. So we don't see any result of weakening or the owners of the media or the executive side of the media trying to hide these hated personalities or these criticized personalities from view.
But that wasn't the case during wars. When there was a severe criticism during wars, something else happened. What happened then?
Well, this was not the government pressure. Well,
Right.
Haaretz's problems with Haaretz. One thing that's unique about Haaretz is that Haaretz occasionally goes against the prevailing thought of its own readers, and the cases in point are always when Israel goes to war, and there's criticism of the conduct of war, not in terms of was the decision to attack smart or not, but moral criticism of military conduct, and it reached a boiling point 3 years ago during the last war in Gaza, when we published an op-ed criticizing the morality of Air Force pilots dropping bombs on on the private residences of Hamas personnel in Gaza and killing civilians in the process. We never faced any criticism from the military. Our reporters were embedded, when the ground offensive began, our reporters were embedded. I was invited to all the briefings by the chief of staff during the war. The outgoing commander of the Air Force, who commanded these pilots during the war, in a farewell interview a couple of weeks ago, said that he didn't like to read that. And it was painful, but that's freedom of speech and freedom of the press. But we suffered from kind of community policing. A couple of thousand of subscribers canceled their subscription. And few of us spent the entire war corresponding with these angry readers and explaining why it was important. My view was that if you have, in Israel we have this phrase called yorim vebochim, shooting and crying. Or when the war is over, then you're criticizing the conduct afterwards. We should have done it differently, and so on. And it began in a soul-searching process of several kibbutznik soldiers after the 6-day war 50 years ago. We believe that if you want to make a difference, and if you want to influence the way the war is run, then you have to do it when it's fought, and not afterwards, when it's just to clear a conscience, but it's meaningless. But it's not an easy position.
Yeah.
And after the war, I shared a panel with one of the anchors of Channel 2, which is the main news channel in Israel. And the criticism was both of that particular piece, but also because but that was an opinion piece by Gideon Levy, by an opinion writer. Besides that, we were the only ones reporting the numbers of Palestinian casualties in front page headlines, where in the other media it was buried deep in the newscast or page 17. And the Channel 2 anchor said that during the war, the military approached the television executives and begged them to air more footage of damage and destruction in Gaza, because the military was under criticism for not doing enough to punish Hamas. So they said, show the public that we are punishing the Palestinians. And she said that they debated it within the editorial staff of Channel 2, and they decided that their viewers would be too angry to see that, so they said no to the army.
Wow.
That was when they were less than patriotic to the army, but obviously nobody knew about it till the war was over.
That's fascinating.
And another element is not the wars, but the coverage of the Palestinian society. Unlike all the other newspapers, radio, television sites, Haaretz covers much more the Palestinian society. And this is being criticized a lot by Israelis or readers of Haaretz here in the United States. What's your answer to their criticism?
It's not covering the Palestinian society. It's covering the occupation and describing what it means to live under occupation, either in terms of interviewing families of Palestinians who were killed by the IDF or Israeli police, and obviously Haaretz is the only one doing that, but also describing the bureaucratic nightmare, which is the occupation, and how Israel still runs day-to-day Palestinian lives despite being away from Gaza or privatizing some of its control to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And Haaretz were the only ones reporting it. But you know what? Our readers, and even outside our readership, we're less criticized for that. Because people say, we don't want to read about it. But it's okay that someone does it, and usually they don't come against it. It's only when there is criticism of the IDF, which is a very sacred and important institution in Israeli society, that people are angry. But they're willing to live with reporting what's happening on the Palestinian side, even from a very pro-Palestinian point of view. They just don't read it. Or if there's severe criticism of the settlements, again, we're not punished by our readers for that.
But conservative Jewish groups in the United States are very vocal about that. They say, all right, if you publish it in Hebrew and Israelis read it, that's fine, but don't publish it in English, in the English version for the entire world to see. And they are very unhappy with it. Camera and other organizations. What do you tell them when they criticize you for that?
First of all, we're entitled to be criticized by anybody. It's okay. They have their freedom of criticism as well. Number two, it reminds me of my grandmother's stories about the shtetl. That, there's something you say in Yiddish, but you don't say in Russian or Ukrainian, so the neighbors wouldn't understand. Look, it's ridiculous. We live in a globalized world, and clearly there are stories that are inconvenient to people who support the occupation and settlements. So they try to argue that the translation is not exact, and so on and so forth. Some of them are partly funded by publishers of competing media outlets. Look, we do our job; they have theirs.
It's a free country.
It's a free country. It should be free, but it doesn't change the way we see the world. It's it only shows that it's not like reporting the weather forecast or reporting some incident or even corruption in Israel. This is there are people who oppose the idea that you can even call it occupation, and don't want to hear about it. And they believe that if this reporting is shut down, then global criticism of Israeli conduct will disappear or be mitigated.
Dana, Haaretz organized 3 years ago a conference on peace. The Israeli peace groups could not agree who will lead that conference. So Haaretz became the leading force.
There are 120 NGOs or less organized groups supporting peace in Israel. And they can't agree on anything.
But they could agree that Haaretz will do that. My question to you is, can you see the Washington Post organizing a conference against something which is a political topic?
It was not against. It was for. And we had.
For you, it's for somebody else, it's against.
But we had speakers from the most right-wing parties and from the government taking part. And interestingly, the most recent one, which took place earlier in the summer, and that was after Donald Trump was elected, there was much more demand from the right wing to participate and to legitimize the message or to correspond to the pro-peace message because of what Trump was saying and promoting at the time. That was interesting. That Trump had an effect on our peace conference. When we started it in the summer of 2014, it coincided with the first day of the Gaza war, although it was planned far in advance. I mean, the closing music of the conference was the sirens going off in Tel Aviv with the first rocket attack from Gaza. But at that time, people treated us like lunatics. They said peace. The word peace disappeared from the Israeli political dictionary years before. In the last election, nobody, no party, right or left, campaigned for peace or even mentioned it in its slogans. So we appear to be lunatics for even using the word, the P word. And now it's more legitimate, although the Trump peace initiative doesn't really take off. But
what other influences does Trump have on Israeli society, Israeli politics, politicians, the media, direct or indirect?
I don't think that Trump has an effect on Israeli society or on Israeli foreign policy or domestic policy, but Trump legitimized more aggressive political conversation. And obviously it affects Israeli politicians who maybe, may have wanted to do this before, and now it's kind of common.
Can I bring up another subject that's very hot here is Russian meddling in the 2016 elections. First of all, do you know whether Israel is helping the United States try to unravel this?
I have no idea.
Okay. And have you ever had a similar issue?
No, Israel's issue with we have many issues with Russia.
Right.
Many of us families came from Russia. We have the largest relative number of Russian speakers in Israeli society in any country outside the former Soviet Union in Israel, what President Putin calls my million friends in Israel. There is a thriving Russian language culture in Israel, outside politics, and we have the defense minister, Lieberman, who's the leader of the Russian-speaking community, very prominent politician in Israel. But the main thing that's important in Israeli-Russian relations is not domestic affairs, but the Russian control of Syria. And the fact that Russia became the strongest military power across Israel's border 2 years ago, and its influence is growing as President Assad is gaining more strength within Syria vis-a-vis his rivals in the civil war. And therefore, Israel has to coordinate policy with Putin after 25 years in which Russia was not a player. I attended a dinner with some senior British intelligence official who visited Israel several months ago. And the entire conversation there were like a couple of journalists, a couple of members of Knesset, former military types, and people like think tank people. The entire conversation was about Russia. And at some point I was asking, if we had this dinner 3 years ago, the word Russia wouldn't be mentioned. So Russia is very prominent, but in Israel it belongs in the strategy department rather than the political department.
And you don't see Russia, is RT or Sputnik in Israel? Is there any effort by the Russians to manipulate public opinion?
Not that we're aware of or...
So the other thing I wanted
It was never raised.
You to reflect on is how in the past
By the way, one more thing. In Israel, Israel is a startup nation and the hub of innovation and high tech and so on and so forth. But the election in Israel is done with paper notes, with printed paper notes, which are less vulnerable to cyber attacks than in America.
We're all going to go back to paper. I'd like your views on the lessons that you've learned from covering anti-Semitism. And I think that it's not only relevant for reporters who are trying to do that now here, as we see the rise in anti-Semitism, but also the rise of white supremacists. So when you look back on your coverage of anti-Semitic groups, not necessarily in Israel, but in near Israel.
Well, on our Hebrew side, it was never a big story. In recent years, it mostly related to anti-Semitic incidents in France and to their influence on French Jews either coming to live in Israel or buying property in Israel. And at some point, it really affected the real estate market in Israel. More recently, there were more reports about anti-Semitic incidents in America. Some of them, now we know, were related to the hacker who was eventually caught and who used to call Jewish community centers and threaten with bomb threats that never happened. Our English side is more focused on that due to its readership, and it's obviously more of a story to our English language readers. We don't really have constant coverage of white supremacists. I mean, we do write stories about them. Most recently, we do it more and more. But we don't have like assigned reporters who cover this as a beat. But maybe an idea.
And what about the BDS? How much do you cover that phenomenon? In what way? What's your policy regarding the BDS?
The
Do you want
policy.
to explain what that is?
The BDS is a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that calls to punish Israel for the occupation. And I mean, it's really, it's not an organization with a platform. There are people who oppose the occupation, and there are people who don't think that Israel should exist as a Jewish state anywhere. The current Israeli government, we've been hearing reports and stories about the influence of the BDS campaign in American campuses, and the fact that many Jewish students and their parents were afraid of being openly supportive of Israel in liberal environments like that. In Israel, it was felt at a time when some musicians canceled their concerts. But the counter-campaign broke it down. I mean, so Israelis don't feel the wrath of the BDS movement. They mostly hear about it through Israeli politicians, right-wing politicians who are trying to build their own career through speaking up against BDS. Haaretz thinks that our editorial position has been that people should be allowed to support boycotts. Haaretz doesn't support boycott. I think that I have to check it, that we're even in the list of Israeli businesses that operate in the settlements. We have subscribers in the settlements. We deliver the paper there. So we might be under BDS boycott as well. But our publisher, for example, we have several writers, including a publisher, who support that kind of external pressure as the only means to change Israeli policy. I mean, there is debate within the Israeli liberal camp, within the Israeli left. Can we rely on change from within, as I believe, or it's a lost hope and the only change, if, can only come from through outside, through external pressure?
How do you cover the territories? Do you have a bureau there, or do you have people that go in and out all the time?
Both. We have one correspondent who lives in Ramallah, the only Israeli Jew who lives permanently and reports from the Palestinian Authority. And we have two other full-time writers who cover the story, and our reporter in Jerusalem. Half of what he does is to cover East Jerusalem and tensions there and settlements there and so on. And we have other writers who cover occasionally the occupation stuff.
Let me move to another field, please, if I may, and that is the decline of the written media, the newspapers.
The written media is
printed media. Haaretz suffers from that, like American newspapers. How do you deal with this problem? How is the Israeli phenomena similar to the one in the United States? Is it different? What's going to be in the near future? How do you fight it?
Well, we wipe the tears every morning, and then we try to find ways for dealing with it. Well, the first thing we did, we changed the product. The first thing we did several years back was to start selling weekend-only subscriptions. And today we have, I think we have more weekend-only subscribers in print than weekday subscribers. We realized that there's a growing group of people who are used to get their news from screens throughout the week when they're in the offices and their offices and so on, but on weekends love to read the printed copy with no WhatsApp or no text or emails are bumping up when you're reading that. But you don't have links and you don't have videos and so on. And it's growing. more and more people are buying weekend subscriptions. And we started, and we're the only ones in Israel who sell digital subscriptions. We started in English, where the readers were educated by the likes of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal that you should pay for news. And in Hebrew, we're the only ones who do that for 4 years, and it's growing. So if you're differentiated enough, you can still sell your product. The challenge you're facing in advertising is that digital advertising belongs to giants like Google and Facebook. To them, Haaretz or even the Washington Post are very small competitors. And also that's one challenge. At the same time, the digital revolution enables you to reach out to many, many, many more people than you could dream of 20 years ago. I mean, the fact that we're even having this conversation, when I joined Haaretz, it was a small town newspaper in Hebrew. And those people who wanted to read it from the outside needed to rely on their embassies translating part of the copy or NGOs. This is very different. Now our voice is heard all around the globe. The other thing that you do is to change the cost structure. So you're relying more and more on bloggers, on freelancers, on people who have the day job at some university and part-time, op-ed writers or critics and so on. So you have many more voices, but you have to keep I think the key to survival here or to professionalism here is to keep a pool of full-time reporters who do reporting. But all the rest, you can rely on many, you can have top talent from academia who like to have the stage and like to have the outreach of the newspaper, but they have their tenure and pension from someone else.
So we have a fair number of students here, and I wonder if you could give them some advice on being a good reporter, and also the adults. Maybe there's some people who want second careers as reporters.
Work hard, beat the opposition, Read all the President's Men, it's all in there. I still give it, although now we know the solution to the puzzle and so on, with Deep Throat and all that, I still give this book to young editors because I think it really tells you how to do the job.
How to build sources.
How to build sources, how to protect them, how to negotiate with your editors, how to build trust with your editors, because it's not only the sources. Your editors have to believe that when you say that you spoke to an anonymous source, you really spoke to them and they really gave you hard information.
So what story?
And I don't think that's changed. I mean, the digital age, Schmidical age, it doesn't matter. It's still the same basic foot reporting should not be changed. And we need to preserve that. If we want to survive, we need to preserve it. We can cover it with layers and layers of other talent. But to be newspaper or to be a news organization, you need to have that kind of reporting. That's the basis of everything.
Next month, in 4th of October, the Columbia Journalism Review is going to have a conference in Atlanta to discuss some of the major problems of journalism today. I look at the topics that they're going to discuss. We covered 3 of them. I want to ask you about the 4th. We discussed the rise of fake news and its use as a political weapon. We discussed the factors behind increasing threat to the press and the First Amendment. That Israel doesn't have First Amendment, by the way. And we
Israel doesn't have any law. We don't have a constitution at all. But Israel doesn't have any law that protects the freedom of the press. It's only enshrined in Supreme Court rulings dating back to 1953. And it could be overturned by a new majority of justices as we speak.
One topic that we haven't discussed and I want to ask you about is, I'm reading from the brochure of that conference, what can be done to repair the country's trust in the media? Now, trust in the media in Israel is very low. It's about 30%, like United States. What can be done to improve the trust in the media?
You know, I'm always puzzled by these polls saying that 30% trust the media, but the other 70% still watch television, read news sites, listen to the radio, news shows, read newspapers. I mean, do they really? And when they do that, when they watch the news, do they really think it's fairy tale? Do they really mistrust whatever they see or hear or read as fake? I don't think so. I think they don't like. Maybe media personalities appear to be condescending to them and know it all. Oftentimes we get criticized, even by our readers, that we are condescending. That who do you think you are? And there's always the problem that people say, when you report about my specific industry or business or profession, you're making so many mistakes. How can I trust you when you report about other issues? But the thing is that I think most people, even when they don't like to say it, they do trust the media. Because media consumption, not paying for news, but media consumption is on the rise. People consume much more media than ever. The challenge to that is social networks. And I think here the balance is clearly tilted. If 6, 7, 8 years ago, social networks, Facebook, Twitter, people quoted the media in their feeds, today, most political reporting in Israel as well as in the United States is quoting from Twitter, which is very, very easy for journalists. You don't have to call the spokesperson every night. You get it, it's verified, it's quotable, you cut and paste it, you don't need to verify anything. Here we see a change balance. So do people trust their Twitter feed? I guess they do. Otherwise they wouldn't subscribe to it. And I think this to many people, this replaces the role of traditional media. So the challenge is to be relevant in the age when people talk to the prime minister or to the president directly, without our mediation, and we need to reinvent our role in society because of that direct connection between the sources and the audience. That wasn't there. I mean, so there were talking heads on television, but it's not the same as the permanence of the feed. It's always easy to get back to. It's not some video that you need to find the quote in and so on.
The mainstream media got the 2016 elections absolutely wrong, And we were talking in my class the other day, should somebody be held accountable for that? And should they figure out why they got that wrong? Were they not out in the countryside listening to people in a way that they should have? And what are your thoughts about that?
Well, we faced the same problem in 2015 in our election, when all the polls indicated an uphill challenge for Netanyahu. And only in the final days, he reversed the trend by going after the right-wing, the smaller right-wing satellite parties of Likud and eating up their voter base. And everybody in the media missed that. And I remember there were two people who told me that we were wrong. One is one of our editors, who edits the cultural section, who grew up in Kiryat Shmona, in one of the Likud strongholds in the north of Israel, and she went to see her friends there like a week before the election, and she came back and said, Bibi's winning it. And 2 days before the election, I had coffee with the PR guy who wanted to sell me some story unrelated to politics. Now he was under arrest for the submarine corruption investigation. So I was like, but 2 days before the election, he told me, "Listen, you're totally misreading it. we're going to win and we're going to win big. But the thing is, this is not a sample that you can rely on. And in our case, in Israel, there's always last-minute surprise in most campaigns. Usually, it's a smaller party that grows in the final days and steals the election and becomes the linchpin in the coalition. In the previous election, it was Yair Lapid, who came from nowhere to be the second largest party and became the finance minister and Netanyahu's main coalition partner. It's very difficult to discern. We're not allowed to publish polls in the final days in Israel, and the polls might have missed it too.
But is there another reason as well, which is very similar to the case in the United States, and that is that the journalists are living in their bubble in Tel Aviv, and they don't go to the periphery, exactly what happened here in the elections. And therefore, the journalists in Israel are criticized for not representing the majority of the people who live in the periphery.
But in the Israeli case, the main thing to watch was the defection of settlers from Bennett's party to Netanyahu in the final days. And the right-wing media that reports, whose reporters grew up and live in these places, got it wrong as well. So you can argue that they wanted to say that Netanyahu was losing because they wanted, because they wanted to attract voters to support Netanyahu. But they didn't get it better than the left-wing or center-left media in Israel. They didn't say the settlers are fleeing Bennett to keep Netanyahu in power. There was not a single story of that in any of the mainstream media, and today you have many more reporters in Israel. Look, the social divide in Israel it's a much smaller country. The social divide in Israel is very different than in the United States. So a direct comparison is very much more difficult to make. But today you have many more visible right-wingers in prominent positions in the Israeli mainstream media. They didn't report a different story than Haaretz reporters deeply embedded in the Tel Aviv bubble.
Shall we open it to the questions for the public?
Definitely.
All right, so if you have questions, there are 2 microphones, and you are welcome to ask. We need the first volunteer, the rest will follow, I'm sure. Here is the first brave volunteer.
All right, there's one.
Yeah, my name's Joe Oppenheimer. And you were asked a question about coverage of anti-Semitism and white supremacy. Let me rephrase that, which would make it perhaps more generalized to Israel. Our problem here is more generally racism in its more general scope. And I think that's true in Israel also. So I'm going to ask you, how do you cover issues of racism? Is that a particularly is that a concern, especially given the different ethnic backgrounds of the population, as well as in the differences between the Palestinian and Israeli population?
It's hard to say if it's the number one issue that we're covering, but it's very prominent. It's very, very prominent issues of racism. We have several. Obviously, our opinion page. In Israel, there are several kinds of racism. Jewish Arab racism, Ashkenazi Sephardic racism, and these are issues that we devote enormous space to. And for example, we just had several stories about how smaller towns, Jewish smaller towns in Israel, are keeping Arab residents away, or blocking the entrance of Arabs to the town, blocking the entrance of, for example, in Kochav Yair, one of the elite places in Israel that's surrounded by Arab towns, how they managed to keep their Arab neighbors away from the swimming pool. Because in the Arab towns, they don't have swimming pools at all. But when the neighbors knocked on the door to join the country club of Kochav Yair, they found ways to block them. So these stories we cover all the time.
Yes, Joe.
That's Israeli improvisation.
Yeah. It's a
First of all,
VIP mic.
Thank you for coming. We're delighted to have you. My question is, how strong is the influence of Sheldon Adelson in Israel society, buying up newspapers?
Well, it's very difficult to measure because on one hand, Israel Hayom is let's zoom out for those in the audience who are less familiar with the details. A decade ago, Sheldon Adelson appeared in the Israeli media scene with the establishment of Israel Hayom, as I said, a free distributed newspaper with the largest circulation in Israel. Proper disclosure, Haaretz was the printing press. Our printing press printed Israel Hayom for 7 years. So they were the major client of the printing operation of Haaretz until Maariv, that used to be the #2 newspaper, went under and Adelson bought their printing press and now he prints his own paper. Israel Hayom from its inception has been a very pro-Netanyahu newspaper until recently. Recently, there are days when they are critical of Netanyahu and pro-Bennett in their front page. And since Netanyahu rose to power, you could read the front page of Israel Hayom as kind of pravda. In other words, you save the call to the Prime Minister's office because you have all the messages on the front page. And now we know, due to a freedom of information appeal, that Netanyahu used to talk to the editor, the former editor of Israel Hayom, day in and day out, and before election it was like 5 times a day. So he was the major source. Now we know that he was the primary source of these front pages. Is it influential? In several ways, it is. First of all, since Israel Hayom was established, Netanyahu has yet to lose an election. He won all 3 elections. Now, you can argue that this was due to other reasons and other factors, but clearly it didn't hurt him. And for years before that, he argued that Yediot Ahronot used to be the most dominant newspaper in Israel, controlling 2/3 of the market of circulation. And they dominated the news cycle completely. And Netanyahu didn't want to be dependent upon the publisher of Yediot Ahronot. So he had his friend establishing a supportive newspaper. Now we know that he didn't trust Israel, and Netanyahu didn't trust Israel Hayom to keep him in power. So before the last election, he had a series of conversations with Noni Moses, the publisher of Yediot Ahronot, in which he tried to trade a reduction in the circulation of Israel Hayom in return for less hostile coverage in Yediot Ahronot. This matter is now under police investigation for possible...
How is he going to do that?
Through legislation, through regulation. There was a pending legislation to force Israel Hayom to sell its copy for 1 shekel. Which eventually, and it won like the preliminary reading in the Knesset, the preliminary reading, and then Netanyahu blew his coalition apart and called an early election. But on the other hand, there is an argument that Israel Hayom has very little influence because the other media, by and large, ignore it. Its op-eds are seldom quoted. It's mostly quoted or ridiculed as a way to show the Netanyahu party line or how they're trying to protect Netanyahu and his wife from the corruption charges and so on. But they're not really part of the conversation. They're not treated. Now they have a new editor. The previous one never tried. His policy was against scoops. Against scoops. I mean, you could see that there were no scoops, and then I heard from someone who had a very prominent position, in Israel Hayom. He said, Amos Regev, the editor, told us, "I don't want scoops. Give me straightforward paper of record coverage," which they still do They're like the last ones who still do good old paper of record coverage. Their digital operation is only now gaining strength. And then Edelson, before the last election, he did what apparently was more important in terms of influence. When he bought Makor Rishon. Makor Rishon is kind of a right-wing equivalent of Haaretz. A more serious paper, not a tabloid, it's weekly. They have a website, but it's a weekly broadsheet that appears on weekends with a very partisan right-wing settler point of view. Its editor is one of the leaders of the settler movement, a graduate of what used to be called the Jewish Underground, a terrorist group operating back in the 80s, who says, I was a terrorist for one night and it stuck with me, with reputation for years. And they are very important in the right-wing settler voter base. And arguably, Edelson bought it before the last election, and it was very instrumental in moving these crucial votes from Bennett to Netanyahu in the final days of the election. So this is another way which is more under the radar because unlike Israel Hayom, there's no debate about Makor Rishon, about its editorial policy, about its professionalism, and people actually, it has very small circulation outside its reader base, and people like it. Nobody says, nobody is bad-mouthing Makor Rishon. But apparently it might be even more important to Netanyahu than, when it matters, than Israel Hayom, which is more like the party line.
Yes, please.
Thank you for this interesting discussion. I'm Ben Schneiderman. I'm a professor of computer science here with strong ties to Israel professionally and personally. And I would like to hear your reflection on the distinction between the role of science in Israel, which seems to be still a respected institution, the Weizmann Institute, Technion, and so on, whereas here we have a detachment of that science and trust in science has become a central policy issue. I don't think, does that exist in Israel? Are there signs of that growing?
You're talking about natural sciences, not philosophy. We're talking about physicists, about...
Sure. Well, climate science, vaccinations, there's many science issues for which the denial in this country has become a central issue.
In Israel, religion is very strong. And, but there's no debate about evolution in the same way as there is here. But evolution doesn't exist in Israeli high school textbooks. If you want to study evolution in Israel, you have to go to university. Science and scientists enjoy a special role in Israeli society that dates back to David Ben-Gurion, who invested a lot of effort in promoting this community. So there is no issue, and I don't know of any politician or any social group that calls to cut back on the natural sciences. Departments in Israel, scientific research and engineering departments are seen as the basis both of our security through the defense industry and military gizmos and so on, and also the basis of the Israeli economy. And the religious parties have other issues to attend to. Where you see the conflict is, for example, there is an issue now in Israel about what we call hadata. Would you translate it? Religionization of the discourse, and especially the military and the education system. So there was this NGO, the Secular Forum, that disclosed that in many textbooks you see the religious family where everybody is sitting around the table having a great time, and the secular family where everybody is shouting at each other and so on. So they advised parents to flip through the textbooks of their kids, and our diplomatic correspondent, Barak Ravid, who was usually the best scooper on foreign policy and of Netanyahu and issues like that, his daughter went to first grade, to elementary school. So he flipped through the science book, and he saw that the explanation of how farmers grow their crops is that, you know, they plow the land and they sow the seeds, and then they pray to God to bring rain. In the science book, not in the Bible book or in the religion book. So he published it on Twitter, and there was a firestorm, and with Benn, the education minister, blaming him for being anti-Semitic and so on. And then another correspondent of ours interviewed the writer, who was a scientist, and he asked her, "Why did you put the prayer as part of science?" And she said, "Well, the Minister of Education asked me." By the way, that was before Bennett's term. That was under a secular minister, but that's the kind of debate that we have. But it doesn't. There is a big debate about funding of cultural institutions because of criticism, and you know, the liberal arts departments in Israel are closing down because of lack of candidates, of students. But so far, the scientific community per se is immune from these debates. Not only that, the government spends a lot of money trying to attract Israeli scientists back from their careers in the States and elsewhere.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Hannah London. I'm a freshman here. And this past academic year, I took a gap year in Israel. I lived in Hod HaSharon, so very close to where you're from. And then I worked in Givatayim. And something I noticed in the Israeli society, especially living in Hod HaSharon, which is very close to the Green Line, is no one really talks about, or like the idea of the occupation is never really brought up in like everyday society. Like the Hebrew word for occupation is kibush, and like no one knows it really. So I'm just curious how much you publish that in your Hebrew language, Haaretz. I know it's very prevalent in the English language.
Well, in English, it's this story, because our English language readers care less about the Israeli soccer league or Israeli or Hebrew language culture, which we devote a lot of coverage to. But it's a very prominent issue in our news pages and our opinion pages. About half our editorials are directly or almost directly related to the occupation. But as you say, it's a lone voice. Most people on the west side of the Green Line, west of the Green Line, mention not the occupation. They mention the Palestinians only when there is some security crisis, and after the Hamas takeover and the turning point. There were two turning points here. One was the Second Intifada, erupting right after the failure at Camp David. We covered it. It was not very far from here, 17 years ago, and then. But even after that, the Israeli public supported the withdrawal from Gaza. But since the Hamas takeover of Gaza, people on the Israeli side of the Green Line simply shut down. I mean, they couldn't care less about the Palestinians. They had it coming, and it's very difficult to raise the issue. What people talk about in the Israeli Jewish society is, the price of real estate, vacations abroad, the religization of education is a far more popular topic, even among our readers. When you see when I get the weekly report of Facebook shares, these stories get way more shares than occupation stories. By the way, the exception here is the right-wing media, like Makor Rishon. They don't call it occupation, obviously. They call it Yeshvut, and they see it in good terms, but they devote a lot of coverage and conversation to that.
Aluf, I'm Eran Carmel. I'm from American University here in Washington, D.C. So I'm an Israeli American. I've been reading Haaretz for half a century. I inherited that from my parents. So I've been reading it for many years, and so I have two questions for you, which are going to be critical here, but really from a good place. I'm not being critical from the right.
That's okay. Also.
So first of all, I think that my sense and I don't have a timeline on this, but my sense is that Haaretz has moved to a point further left than it was for many years. You described this as what, a kumsitz?
What a shivet.
Achvat Hashevet, okay.
What a shivet. The
Okay,
tribal
so
campfire.
this kumbaya of all the mainstream Israeli press in American jargon, which I accepted, it used to be like that, but when the forces took you, you went too far to the left. And so that's one, I'd like you to comment about that. And number two, an outcome of that, I think, is that Haaretz, which is the only liberal newspaper in Israel to the left of center, has marginalized itself in Israeli political discourse as a result. It's too far to the left from the mainstream, and that is really your responsibility to bring it back in order to have more of an influence.
Well, to your second question or answer, I'd say that how can you judge the influence? I mean, we're quoted with the basis of discussion many times, and the circulation is growing. So I don't think that and not only and that at a time when, for example, the mainstream TV news channels have lost between 1/4 to 1/3 of their viewers in recent years, not because of Netflix, simply because people are not interested in watching them. The issue of radicalization, you have two explanations here. One is that the government policy is more radical as well. So it's a kind of tango here. It's not, you have more to criticize. We never had a minister of cultural affairs who started a day in attacking the cultural institutions and film directors and trying to shut down left-wing and Arabic language theaters. This never happened before. Or maybe it happened during the Ben Gurion days, but that was a different Israeli society back then. The other explanation is that it's true. We're the only ones, as I said, who are willing to ask questions about the three basic tenets of the Israeli mainstream discourse. That is Holocaust, not the Holocaust per se, but the way Holocaust is reflected in current political and social discourse in Israel. The military, including public examples of bereavement and how it's expressed in the TV and so on, and the morality of the military. And the others don't touch it. So you can say, okay, shut down and don't say anything and be part of the mainstream. But for what? What are we going to gain? What is Israeli society going to gain by this self-censoring? Now, you can argue that these issues existed before and nobody spoke about them. But I don't think that Holocaust memory was so politicized as the way it is today, as justification for everything, including bizarre assertions by Netanyahu that the Mufti, that the Palestinian leader initiated the Holocaust rather than Hitler. We have another issue where we are totally at odds with the mainstream, and that is the treatment of African asylum seekers, mostly from Eritrea and Sudan in Israel. We're talking about 40,000 people that the government is trying to chase and to kick out of Israel. And we're the only ones in Israeli society, in Israeli mainstream media and so on. There are NGOs who support these people, but we're the only ones in the media who are willing even to listen to these people and not just call them infiltrators who threaten the Jewish bases, the Jewish majority in Israel. 40,000 people threaten 6.5 million majority in Israel. But we believe that this is the right position to take. And as I said, we're not shrinking.
Thank you. We have 5 more minutes. So there are 3 people here. Do you want to each ask the question, and then you're going to have to remember all 3 and, and respond? Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Matthew Eisenberg, and I'm a student here. In America, Donald Trump sort of bounced around from major scandal to major scandal, but hasn't really lost any support among his hardcore supporters. So my question is, with Netanyahu and his corruption scandal, is the same thing happening, or is he starting to lose support in public opinion and among his most hardcore supporters?
No.
That's an easy one, okay. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Aaron Logue. I study government, politics, and philosophy here. My question is about the digital shift in terms of how news is consumed, specifically in terms of like more and more students, more and more people in general, getting the news from social media, which is curated algorithmically as opposed to editorially. So instead of somebody putting something, like an individual putting something on the front page, it's an algorithm telling me what I would be most interested in. So my question is, first of all, is this an issue? Is this something to be worried about or concerned about, or what do you think the impact is going to be?
As I said, it's one of the major challenges of journalism to be relevant in the age of social networks. And you see that journalists rely more and more on social networks, both in terms of direct sourcing for stories. Donald Trump tweeted this or that, and also to assess the trends of what people are talking about. You know, the legendary editor of Yediot Achronot, the dean of Israeli journalism, when I was a kid, David Kovsky, the story about him was that he used to go to the post office just to listen to people standing in line to hear what they were talking about. Today, you have it in your palm, on your iPhone, your old iPhone 7. Stone Age iPhone 7, and it's a challenge. But you know, it's not something that you can fight. You need
to relate the question. I meant more so that the news we're consuming isn't it's because it's algorithmic. It can be more in line. For example, there were many stories during the election about how we're giving because it's more in line with our partisan views or things like that. So I was wondering very specifically about the formulation of news in terms of how it's provided to us, that it's not provided by an editor anymore. It's not the most important stories or that aren't necessarily, the ones that we see the most aren't necessarily the ones that an editor shows us at the front page, but are rather the ones that could be most popular according to the algorithm. Does that, I'm sorry, is this getting across, is this question making sense?
No, it's making sense, and as I said, the importance here is to have independent distribution channel. Your app, you know, you have your Facebook feed and you're there all day long, but you still have the alternative of clicking an app, of whatever. And to survive, newspapers or news organizations will have to do the utmost to sustain their independent distribution, because otherwise, you're totally dependent upon Google and Facebook. You have no influence on the algorithm. You have no influence on your distribution, who reads you, when they read you, and so on. So, and it's becoming more and more difficult because most of your audience gets to you through Facebook and Google and Twitter, and not directly. But you must, just as you must keep a core group of reporters, you must keep independent distribution channel, and it's becoming more and more expensive and difficult to sustain.
Thank you very much.
And they're stealing part of your revenue too, right? Your ad revenue. Go ahead. Last question.
Hi, my name is Jamie West. I'm a senior here at the University of Maryland. So I'm gonna switch gears here. Netanyahu is currently in South America, and I believe he's visiting Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico.
He's in Buenos Aires today, yeah.
Right. So I was just wondering on the media end, how is the Israeli media framing this? Because from the US perspective, they're saying that they're enhancing diplomatic ties with this part of the world. But I know Israel, especially Netanyahu, has been trying to plan conferences with various African countries, also developing those relationships. So in terms of the media, how is the Israeli media portraying this? And in terms of the Israeli public, how are they reacting to this? And then in your personal opinion, how do you think that this is going to affect Israel's standing as a global leader?
Well, personally, you know, I miss covering the beat because I could have, if I still covered the diplomatic beat, I could visit my second cousins in Buenos Aires today. But more seriously, look, there was an argument about the growing isolation of Israel several years back, which former defense minister, Prime Minister Ehud Barak, called the diplomatic tsunami. That never happened. Israel is popular, Netanyahu is meeting all these leaders. But on the same day that he's visiting Latin America, an African-Israeli summit was called off, apparently due to pressure by Arab states. Look, these stories are covered. Occasionally there's the reader who writes to me, how come you didn't cover the visit of the foreign minister of Macedonia whenever Chancellor Merkel is saying something about the occupation, it's front page news. Look, we don't cover every visit. Today, the days of the paper of record that you cover every visit of the foreign minister of the tiniest state are gone. Clearly, Israel is very popular in many areas around the world, but on the most basic issue, and that is how the world, the global community treats occupation and settlements, the answer is Security Council Resolution 2334 from the final days, which President Obama allowed to pass through abstention. And there was no one voting against it. No one, and that hasn't changed. You can argue that Israel sustains the occupation settlements regardless of the stated position of the international community, which is true, which has been true for the past 50 years and counting. It's doubtful to see how come this really affects the position of Israel abroad. You don't see, Prime Minister Modi of India. I mean, the most important visit that Israel has had was of Prime Minister Modi of India, who didn't go to the Palestinian Authority, unlike most foreign leaders who visit Israel. But he met President Abbas separately, and he met the President of Iran, not Israel's best friend, separately. So we don't really see a change in the basic elements of global policy towards Israel. By the way, just as if you look the other way, I was once asked, I met a group of Princeton PhD candidates in Israel, and they asked me, how has Israel's domestic politics affected its foreign policy? And the answer is, it hasn't. Since the failure of Camp David, when Barak came out and said, we have no partner, this has been the mainstream position in Israel. And all governments and all prime ministers, even those who were engaged in empty peace talks that led nowhere, like Olmert and Netanyahu, eventually the policy hasn't changed. So you can argue that Netanyahu travels abroad. When leaders are in trouble at home, they always find condolences away, the time difference, foreign leaders who know less and care less about the exact police charges in Israel. Nice footage. It's nice to have, but I don't think it matters much. But with one footnote, it does testify to the failure of the BDS movement to have any serious impact on global policy towards Israel. Because clearly, if the president of Argentina hosts Netanyahu, you're going to see a lot of trade, ongoing trade and other exchanges between the countries. And if they supported the boycott of Israel, they wouldn't host the prime minister.
Okay, that wraps it up, and we'd like to again thank the Gildenhorn Institute for Israeli Studies, and especially Aluf for coming all this way, and look forward to your next visit. Who knows what we'll talk about in another couple of years. It could be totally different. Thank you.
Thank you.